At exactly 9:45 p.m. on November 12, 2025, in the Oval Office of the White House, President Trump lifted his pen to sign the bill ending the longest government shutdown in American history, 43 days of chaos. Over 1 million federal workers furloughed, 42 million Americans about to lose food assistance. And in that room, surrounded by smiling Republican lawmakers, Trump declared victory. But 250 miles north in Manhattan, in the marble halls of the New York State Attorney General's office, Letitia James was already 3 steps ahead. While Trump celebrated, she was preparing to deliver a legal earthquake that would expose the true cost of his political games. This wasn't just about reopening the government. This was about the moment when justice wore a woman's face and power learned what accountability really meant. At exactly 6:30 a.m. that same morning, 14 hours before Trump would sign that bill, James had stood in her office, overlooking Lower Manhattan, holding a sealed federal court filing that would change everything. The morning light caught the gold lettering on her office door, New York State Attorney General. But today those words carried the weight of 42 million hungry Americans on her shoulders. Her hands were steady as she opened the file marked, Confidential Snap Emergency, Injunction. Inside were 47 pages of legal precision, each paragraph a calculated strike against an administration that thought it could starve its own people into submission. The USDA had suspended food assistance for the first time in SNAP's 60-year history. They claimed they had no choice. James knew better. They had $6 billion in contingency funds, sitting untouched while families faced empty refrigerators. "They want to play politics with people's lives," she whispered to her reflection in the window. But the law doesn't pick sides. 24 other state attorneys general had joined her coalition, but James was leading the charge. This wasn't her first battle with Trump's empire. She'd already secured a $355 million judgment against his organization for financial fraud. She'd taken on the NRA, Big Pharma, and predatory landlords. Each victory had been methodical, surgical, devastating. But this felt different. This was about survival, not just accountability. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 weeks ago, Trump's Justice Department had indicted her on bank fraud charges, a transparent act of political retribution. But Trump had underestimated something fundamental about Letitia James. Growing up as one of 8 children in Park Slope, she'd learned that survival meant fighting back harder than your opponent could hit. Her phone buzzed. A text from her deputy. "Media is calling. They want a statement about the shutdown vote tonight." James smiled. Let them wait. Justice moved on its own timeline, not CNN's breaking news cycle. At 7:15 a.m., 3 floors below in the Attorney General's war room, her litigation team was already assembled around a conference table, covered in legal briefs. The air was thick with coffee and determination. These weren't political operatives. They were career prosecutors who'd spent their lives turning legal theory into courtroom victories.
"The Massachusetts District Court is our best shot," said Deputy Attorney General Sarah Chen, sliding a stack of precedents across the table. "Judge Rodriguez has a history of emergency injunctions in federal benefits cases."
James nodded, but her eyes were fixed on the television mounted in the corner. Fox News was running a chyron. Democrats obstruct shutdown deal. She reached for the remote and turned up the volume. "The Democrats tried to extort our country." Trump's voice filled the room from an earlier interview. "Republicans never wanted a shutdown. People were hurt so badly." The room fell silent. James felt the familiar fire building in her chest. The same fire that had driven her from a legal aid public defender in Brooklyn to the most powerful law enforcement office in New York State. "People were hurt," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "He's the one who let 42 million Americans lose their food assistance. And now he wants to play the victim?" She stood up, commanding the room's attention. "Here's what's going to happen. We filed this emergency motion at 9 a.m. sharp. By noon, every major news outlet will know that while Trump was playing games, we were fighting to keep food on America's tables." But James had learned something crucial during her years battling Trump. Legal victories weren't just about courtroom wins. They were about narrative. And right now, Trump controlled the narrative. He was the president who ended the shutdown. the hero who brought federal workers back to their jobs. She was about to flip that script. At 8:45 a.m., James walked through the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, her heels echoing against the marble floors. Behind her trailed a team of 6 attorneys, each carrying briefcases thick with evidence. The press was already gathering, but she said nothing. Let her legal filing do the talking. Inside courtroom 15-0, she approached the bench where Judge Maria Rodriguez presided. Rodriguez was a Clinton appointee with a reputation for cutting through political theater to reach legal truth. Perfect for what James had in mind. The courtroom was packed. Representatives from all 25 states sat in the gallery behind James. Across the aisle, a phalanx of Justice Department lawyers in identical dark suits looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. They knew they were about to defend the indefensible. "Your Honor," James began, her voice carrying the weight of 42 million hungry Americans, "the federal government possesses $6 billion in congressionally appropriated contingency funds specifically designed to prevent SNAP benefit interruptions during government shutdowns. Yet they chose to suspend food assistance for the first time in the program's 6-decade history." She placed a thick folder on the podium. This folder contains the Congressional Budget Act provisions, the Food and Nutrition Act requirements, and the USDA's own internal memos acknowledging the existence of these funds. The law is crystal clear. The money is available. The only thing missing is the political will to follow the law. She paused, letting that sink in. This isn't about political disagreements. This is about willful violation of federal law. The government's attorney, a nervous young prosecutor from the Justice Department, fumbled through his response. "Your Honor, the shutdown created unprecedented circumstances." "Unprecedented?" James interrupted, though she knew better than to speak out of turn. Judge Rodriguez raised an eyebrow, but allowed it. "The Food and Nutrition Act specifically requires that assistance be furnished to all eligible households. There's nothing unprecedented about following the law." The Justice Department lawyer tried again. "Your Honor, the contingency funds the plaintiffs reference are subject to administrative discretion." "Counselor," Judge Rodriguez interrupted, her voice sharp, "are you arguing that the USDA has discretion to ignore federal law?" James stood up. "Your Honor, the government's own internal memoranda show that USDA administrators discussed using contingency funds but chose not to for what they called strategic considerations. Those appear to be political, not administrative." Outside the courthouse, justice for SNAP was already trending. But this wasn't about social media victories. This was about the single mother in Brooklyn choosing between rent and groceries. The veteran in Buffalo counting out food stamps that wouldn't come. The elderly woman in Syracuse rationing her medication to buy bread. At 11:30 a.m., Judge Rodriguez delivered her ruling. The court finds that the plaintiffs are likely to succeed on the merits of their claim that USDA's suspension of SNAP benefits violates federal law. The government is hereby ordered to use available contingency funds to execute November SNAP benefits immediately. James allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. Then she walked outside to face the camera. "The Trump administration tried to use hunger as a political weapon," she said, standing on the courthouse steps, with the Statue of Liberty visible in the distance behind her. But today the law spoke louder than politics. 42 million Americans will not go hungry because of one man's ego. The questions came fast and sharp. "Attorney General, isn't this just another political attack on the president?" James looked directly into the camera. "When a child goes to bed hungry because their government chose politics over people, that's not political. That's moral. What about tonight's shutdown vote? Will this ruling affect the president's signing ceremony?" The president can sign whatever he wants, but he cannot sign away his obligation to follow federal law. But even as James spoke, the real game was being played behind the scenes. At 2:30 p.m., her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she recognized, the White House.
"Miss James, this is Chief of Staff Susie Wiles."
"The president would like to speak with you." James felt her pulse quicken, but her voice remained steady. "The president knows where to find me. He's prepared to discuss a comprehensive solution to the SNAP funding issue. I'm prepared to discuss his compliance with the federal court order. The president signs the shutdown bill tonight. This ruling complicates the narrative." And there it was, the admission James had been waiting for. Trump's victory lap was about to be crashed by a federal judge and a woman who refused to back down. "Ms. Wiles," James said, her voice carrying the steel that had made her famous. "The only thing that complicates this narrative is the truth. And the truth is that your boss let 42 million Americans go hungry for political theater." At 4:15 p.m., James was back in her office when the call came from CNN. "We have confirmation that the White House is scrambling to implement your court order before tonight's signing ceremony. Sources say the president is furious." Good, James thought. Fury meant she was hitting her target. Her communications director appeared with her phone buzzing. "Attorney General, we've got requests from 63 media outlets. The Today Show wants you live tomorrow morning." James waved her off. "Schedule nothing until this is resolved. The story is the hungry families, not the Attorney General who fed them." By 6 p.m., the USDA had announced emergency procedures to restore SNAP benefits using the contingency funds James had forced them to acknowledge. The irony was perfect. Trump would sign his shutdown victory bill the same day he was forced to admit he'd been illegally starving his own people. At 8:30 p.m., 30 minutes before Trump's Oval Office ceremony, James received a text that made her smile. "SNAP benefits restored nationwide. 42 million Americans can eat tonight." Deputy AG. She walked to her office window and looked out over Manhattan. In the distance, she could see the lights of the bridges connecting the boroughs, the same bridges her grandmother had crossed as a domestic worker in Park Slope 70 years ago. Her grandmother had cleaned houses for wealthy families while raising 8 children on whatever she could earn. She'd never gone hungry because she worked too hard and loved too much. But she'd been one paycheck, one illness, one government decision away from catastrophe. Tonight, 42 million Americans had been pulled back from that edge. James thought about the journey that had brought her here. From legal aid attorney defending the poorest New Yorkers to the city council fighting slumlords and predatory lenders. From public advocate to attorney general. Each step building toward this moment. Every case had taught her something about power, how it worked, where it was vulnerable, how it could be held accountable. The Trump indictment against her had been meant to intimidate, to distract her from cases like this. Instead, it had crystallized everything she believed about the intersection of law and justice. They could prosecute her, attack her credibility, question her motives, but they couldn't change the fact that 42 million Americans had been hungry, and now they weren't. At exactly 9:45 p.m., James turned on the television to watch Trump sign the bill. He was surrounded by Republican lawmakers, all smiles and congratulations. The optics were perfect. Trump, the deal maker, ending the crisis he'd helped create. "Today we are sending a clear message that we will never give in to extortion," Trump said, his voice full of righteous indignation. "The Democrats tried to extort our country." James reached for her phone and typed a simple message on X. 42 million Americans are eating tonight because the law is stronger than politics. Justice doesn't negotiate with extortion, it defeats it. The tweet went viral within minutes. But as James watched Trump hold up the signed bill for the cameras, she wasn't thinking about social media or political points. She was thinking about tomorrow, because while Trump had ended this shutdown, nothing had been resolved. The healthcare subsidies that Democrats had fought for were still hanging by a thread. Federal agencies were still under attack. And Trump was already talking about his next political hostage situation. The war wasn't over. This was just one battle. But it was a battle that showed the world something crucial. Power might control the government, but justice could still control power. As the ceremony ended and the cameras stopped rolling, James walked to her safe and pulled out a thick folder marked Trump Organization, Ongoing Litigation. Inside were hundreds of pages documenting years of financial fraud, tax evasion, and corporate misconduct. The $355 million judgment was under appeal, but the evidence was ironclad. Next to it sat another folder, Federal Retaliation Cases. The bank fraud charges against her were just the beginning. Trump's Justice Department was systematically targeting state attorneys general who'd challenged federal overreach. It was a coordinated campaign to criminalize legal opposition to presidential power. But James had learned something crucial over her decades in public service. Intimidation only worked if you let it. Every threat, every lawsuit, Every attempt at character assassination had only strengthened her resolve. They'd made her a symbol of resistance, when all she'd ever wanted to be was a symbol of justice. Tomorrow there would be new battles. New attempts by Trump to twist the law to his will. New efforts to weaponize government power against his enemies. The healthcare subsidies fight was just beginning. The federal agencies under attack would need defending. And somewhere in a Virginia courthouse, she'd have to fight for her own freedom while fighting for everyone else's rights. But that was tomorrow's war. Tonight was about tonight's victory. But tonight, 42 million Americans could eat. And in the marble halls of the New York State Attorney General's office, a woman who'd learned justice from Brooklyn streets and courtroom battles was already planning her next move. The phone rang, another news outlet wanting comment on the shutdown resolution. James let it go to voicemail. Justice didn't need to explain itself to cable news. It spoke through court orders, and empty stomachs filled.
As she gathered her files, James noticed her reflection in the dark window. The same face that had stared down slumlords in Brooklyn, corrupt officials in City Hall, and now a president who thought he was above the law. Each battle had proven something fundamental. Democracy's defenders came in all forms, united only by their refusal to let power go unchecked.
She gathered her files, turned off the office lights, and headed for the elevator. Outside, Manhattan hummed with its usual energy. Food trucks served late-night workers, bodega owners restocked their shelves. Families sat down to dinner without wondering where tomorrow's meals would come from. Somewhere in Brooklyn, a single mother was opening her refrigerator and finding hope instead of emptiness. In the morning, the headlines would focus on Trump's victory and the end of the shutdown. But buried in the back pages would be a smaller story. NY Attorney General forces government to restore food benefits. Sometimes justice whispered when power shouted. But it always had the last word. James thought about the constitutional crisis that nobody wanted to acknowledge. This wasn't just about SNAP benefits or government shutdowns. It was about whether the rule of law could survive when power decided to ignore it. Trump had tested the boundaries repeatedly. Each time, institutions had held, barely. Tonight had proven that the law could still constrain power, but the real work of strengthening democracy against authoritarian overreach was still ahead. The elevator doors closed, and Letitia James descended into the night, carrying the weight of accountability on her shoulders and the promise of tomorrow's battles in her heart. The law was patient, justice was persistent, and power, no matter how loud it shouted, always eventually had to face both. Trump had his signing ceremony, his moment of triumph, his declaration of victory over democratic extortion. But James had 42 million Americans eating dinner. In the end, that was all that mattered. That was what justice looked like when it refused to bow to power. That was what happened when the law wore a woman's face and spoke with a Brooklyn accent, honed by years of fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. The shutdown was over. The real battle for America's soul was just beginning. And Letitia James would be ready.